Good evening. A very warm welcome to you this evening for this fabulous talk that Professor Sumner is going to give us tonight. We appear to have been given the gift of intimacy tonight, as a friend of mine is fond of putting things. Our talk tonight is being streamed and will be available on the church website. I think that the sudden downpour about an hour ago might be making people think, oh, I'm going to stream this with a hot cup of tea with my feet up. Thank you for braving the storms and coming out tonight. This is the place to be for a talk of this nature with the art wrapping around us. But for those of you who are watching at home, you are very, very welcome indeed, and thank you for joining in on the stream. So whether you are Eastbourne based, I know that some of you have come from Bedford and from London, you are most welcome indeed. I'm Paul Tabraham, I'm one of the ministers here in Eastbourne at Emmanuel. So welcome to New Vision, this fabulous display of art that we've fallen in love with already here at church, and we will only relinquish it with great sorrow in about 2 weeks' time. New Vision, many of you know this already, but New Vision also describes all of this new building that we're in, the four churches coming together, deciding to do something new in Eastbourne and needing a new place, new ways to do it. So New Vision is really all of it. So thank you for coming out tonight, and hopefully if you've not had a chance already, do have a look around the collection afterwards. We've got tea and coffee downstairs too. So without further ado, I'm going to just introduce and welcome Anne to you this evening. Some of you will have met Anne already, some of you know her very well indeed. So Professor Anne Sumner, she is the chair of the management committee for the Methodist Modern Art Collection and has been since 2018. I've got Anne's bio here, and I'm not going to say all of it, but needless to say, that Anne's work as a curator, as an academic, as a writer, as a researcher, has been long in the making and has been at an incredibly high level as well. I urge you, and you can do this when your phones go on at the end of this talk, you can have a look on Anne's website at some of the publications she has written, the emphasis in her works on the art of women, the curating of exhibitions that she's done, particularly in the north of England, the work she's done through Aberystwyth University as a fellow, and of course, really taking the Methodist Modern Art Collection to new levels in the last 6 years in terms of how it operates and how it is handled. And we have been the beneficiaries of that massively here in Eastbourne. So it is an absolute delight to welcome Anne. She's already put in a huge amount of work into this exhibition, guiding us through all sorts of incredible obstacles and unexpected things that happen when you want to put a collection on in a space which is brand new, in a space which is very, very light indeed, and helping us hold an exhibition that we can be proud of and that many people can be in here and enjoy. So far in the exhibition, we have had John Brokenshire come and do a talk. We've had lunchtime devotions. We've had our church nursery and toddlers involved in the exhibition, and all of that's been very much encouraged by Anne to enable sort of a wide range of people and ages to come and see. So without further ado, I shall hand over to Anne, and could we please welcome her with a round of applause. And thank you very much for seeing the spiritual, the story you're about to tell.
Thank you very much. Oh, thanks, Paul, and thank you very much, all of you, to coming out this evening. I gave a lecture at Bath Festival a few days ago, and you're all looking remarkably dry in that lovely car park downstairs. I sort of looked up from my own experience of getting very wet and saw a very wet audience there. So thank you for braving the rain, and thank you for coming this evening. As I said at the opening, the Methodist Modern Art Collection is really one of the great treasures of the Methodist Church. It is this really outstanding collection, and I know many of you here have seen it and travelled far to see it in the past, but it is a really renowned collection, and it has some great highlights in British 20th century art, painters such as Elizabeth Frink, who opens the exhibition here, Patrick Heron, this is a detail on the screens here of our Patrick Heron, Kerry Richards, Graham Sutherland, all of whom are really key figures in mid-20th century British painting, as well as world art, which we have always been interested in. And nowadays, our works by F.N. Souza and Joyce Tisahi, just behind me, are very popular with our public. And from the outset, we were very, very far-sighted in collecting works by women artists as well. Elizabeth Frink, as I've already mentioned, but also artists whose names you might not know so well, such as Eularia Clarke, and I'll be looking a little bit more at her career in a moment. It was always intended, of course, that the collection would be accessible and touring. In 2022, we marked our 60th anniversary, and last year, in 2023, we actually marked our 60th anniversary since our very first tour of the collection. And that collection tour started in July 1963 and it went on till 1969. So it really was a very, very long tour. And what actually accompanied that tour was a secondary exhibition, which was all about architecture and about church furnishings. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in detail later on, but we were very, very interested when the collection was first put together in the new churches that were being built in the 1960s, and yet this is actually the first time that we have ever displayed the collection in a brand new church. So we are absolutely delighted to be here. Well, just as John Wesley travelled around the country preaching, so the Methodist Modern Art Collection has toured from the outset. It has been seen by people in chapels, in churches, in cathedrals, art galleries, schools and universities. It's inspired worship, it's enthused mission, it's absolutely amazed visitors. The main question is, why? I didn't know the Methodist Church had an art collection. People are genuinely surprised when they see it. It has inspired poetry, it's inspired dance and creative writing, and it's encouraged supporters all around the country. So I thought I'd begin by giving you a little bit of a taste of some of the things we've been doing just recently. I mentioned that 2022 was our 60th anniversary, and we lent a number of works all over the country. And in the next slide, I'm just going to show you a picture of one of our Frank Roper sculptures. The majority of our works in the collection are paintings. They're oil paintings or works on paper, but we do have some sculpture. And these works, 4 works from the Stations of the Cross by the by the sculptor Frank Roper, are currently on loan to Woodhouse Grove School in Yorkshire, and they were put on loan there. We had loans across the country at that time, and this has actually been extended so that they had a wonderful programme with their students. And we also wanted to extend it so that it is in place for the City of Culture, which of course is in 2025 Bradford City of Culture, and they'll be very much involved in those celebrations. So Roper is actually a Yorkshire sculptor. He was a pupil of Henry Moore, but he's little known in his county of birth. He's really thought about very much as a Welsh artist most of the time, and so this has been an opportunity for us to explore his career and to remind people he was actually born in the village of Haworth, perhaps better known for the Bronte sisters, but it is our mission to make sure that people will one day be visiting the house where Frank Roper was born. A few words about some other things that we've been doing recently. Last year, in 2023, between February and April, we had an exhibition at Victoria Methodist Church called the Articles of Faith, and I'm just showing you a quick image of that. Articles of Faith, where our paths meet. And this was an exhibition which was curated by Reverend Richard Sharples, a great admirer of the collection, who's borrowed it in a number of different churches. And the title of the exhibition very much suggests that those beliefs which people of faith hold very close to our hearts may be very different, but yet we share so much in common, and hence the strapline where our paths meet. And that was a really extraordinary exhibition, for the first time seeing our works displayed beside works of different faiths and working with different faith communities. And at the same time, we had an exhibition in the new room, the great exhibition space in Bristol, Broadmead, the shopping centre, for those of you who know it. This was a much smaller, much more focused exhibition, Death to Life, which looked at image, expression and symbolism, and really sought to create Lent dialogues. As the co-director of the new room said, whatever belief, faith or meaning you draw from the cross, these paintings show us something raw, stark and poignant. And we have, of course, a number of crucifixions in the collection. And after Bristol, we had an exhibition of 11 works at Kingswood School in Bath as part of the 275th anniversary of the school being founded by John Wesley. And also, as part of the celebrations, they had the Transforming Lives exhibition conference visiting. So the works were actually seen there by Methodist educationalists across the world. So we are very, very pleased indeed to be working with young people at schools across the country, and it is very much our intention to work more broadly with schools in the coming years. More recently, the collection has been shown at Welwyn Garden City in the Deepening the Mystery Unexpected Treasures of Art exhibition, which was on, and I know some of you here this evening actually travelled to see that exhibition as well as coming here. It was extremely important for us to work with Focolari, who work ecumenically, and that's an important part of our mission and our strategy as well. They had some really great events at Welwyn Garden City, such as the Irish Poets Evening. They had Jim Deeds, a poet of Catholic faith, talking about Jim for the soul and soul seasons, as well as a Methodist minister talking about doodlings and doggerel for what was apparently a very lively evening. So I want to go back to our roots and to think a little bit about our very first painting which we purchased. And some of you may be very familiar with the collection, but you perhaps may not know so much about our history. So I'd like to go back to 1962 and the very first painting that came into our collection. It was painted by an Indian artist, Souza, in London, where he was working at the time. He originally came from Goa, and he was raised as a Catholic and went on to study art in Mumbai. In 1947, he founded the Progressive Artists Group, and then he moved to London, where he very much believed that he would be able to establish his career. And here he painted Jesus in agony on the cross. It's a very unrestrained and graphic style, as you can see, much influenced by Picasso. Mary has 4 superimposed eyes, 2 looking at Jesus and 2 looking out at us as the viewer. And while the figures are well lit, the scene is set against a dark blue background. The sun or the moon at Jesus' left represents that solar eclipse suggested in the Bible. This painting has become particularly popular in recent years and really shows how far-sighted our founding fathers were, because it was lent to St Paul's Cathedral as part of the celebrations for 70 years of Indian independence, and you can see here the High Commissioner of India posing next to it at that time. And since then, Souza has been featured in a number of exhibitions, and our requests to borrow the work have increased at the same time as interest of him. The Church of England's post-war response to artistic commissioning is really very well known, and a couple of you have this evening talked to me about some of that very famous commissioning. And of course, many of us are familiar with Basil Spence at Coventry Cathedral and the way that he integrated contemporary art into the interior of that wonderful new building. Less well known, perhaps, is the response of the Methodist Church to a really huge flowering of religious art in post-war Britain. So the Methodist Church Methodist Modern Art Collection was actually founded in the same year that the cathedral was consecrated. And it has a very different story than Coventry Cathedral, although we work very closely with them now, and we established a relationship with them in 2021 when we were there for City of Culture. There was huge press and publicity around the 25th of May in 1962 when Elizabeth II, who came and was much photographed and celebrated at the time of the consecration of the new cathedral. And it was very clear from letters written by our founding fathers that there was interest in Coventry Cathedral and also actually in Llandaff Cathedral in South Wales, and what the Church of England was doing and who they were actually commissioning. So from the outset, in the next slide, you can see the architect Basil Spence commissioned from leading artists of the period, as well as some of the rising stars. So you can see here that he commissioned Graham Sutherland to create this incredible tapestry, which many of you will be familiar with, which is actually the size of a tennis court, just to give it that perspective. So in the 1950s, there was this time of great commissioning of religious art. Britain was rebuilding after the suffering and the damage of World War II, and the power of art to engage people at a really deep spiritual level was becoming more and more celebrated. The Church of England's commissioning is not only in Coventry, but in Chichester Cathedral, of course, with Dean Walter Hussey, commissioning many major works. And the relationship with Coventry and other churches began to be noticed by some Methodist ministers and laymen in South Wales. And the cathedral that they were actually inspired by was Llandaff Cathedral, which you can see here suffered the most damage of any church or cathedral in the United Kingdom, with the exception of Coventry. There were major raids in Cardiff on the 2nd of January 1941. There were 165 people who lost their lives and over 400 were injured. And the decision to rebuild Llandaff actually happened very quickly. The architect there was George Pace, perhaps not as well known as the Coventry architect, but still a man of tremendous vision. And in 1949, he worked very closely with the Bishop of Wales, Archbishop of Wales, to think about how they might create a new and important response to the damage that had taken place. Some of the artists that they approached, like Stanley Spencer, walked away from the idea, but Jacob Epstein and John Piper produced magnificent works for Llandaff Cathedral. And Pace actually was well aware of Frank Roper, who I mentioned to you earlier. In fact, Frank Roper had moved from Yorkshire and was head of art at Cardiff School of Art. And in the next slide, you can see one of his most beautiful. There's a number of works by him in Llandaff Cathedral, but this perhaps is his best known work. It's an extraordinary piece which responds to the reredos, the 15th century carved screen behind the altar. It's a series of gilded panels on each side, designed in 1954, depicting the wild flowers of Wales, given their Welsh names, and honouring the Virgin Mary. His lettering can also be seen in the famous Welsh Memorial Chapel, designed by Pace and dedicated in 1956. So there's considerable interest in commissioning religious art in South Wales at this time. And in the next slide, I'm going to show you an image of the three men who are really responsible for bringing together this extraordinary collection that you see here around you. Historically, art commissioning or the display of religious art has not been a particular activity of non-conformist churches, but the revival of religious art that accompanied the rebuilding from the damage of World War II in Britain was changing that approach. And as I say, the Church of England's response is very well known. So 60 years ago, that initiative to create a modern art collection for the Methodist Church came initially from one man, first of all, Dr. John Morrell Gibbs, a Methodist layman, shown here on the far right of this photograph in profile. He was really passionate about contemporary art, which he collected. His two friends who helped him make the collection a reality are shown here too, Reverend Douglas Wallen, who was central to the plan, and Reverend Percy Watkinson, who was a minister at Trinity Methodist Church in Penarth. So they all lived in South Wales, and Frank Roper lived in Penarth as well. So they most certainly knew him, talked to him, socialised with him. Gibbs felt that the quality of religious art and church furnishings in particular in Methodist churches was poor, and he believed that the church should have a new imaginative approach. So who was this John Gibbs? And you can see him here in his extraordinary modernist house that he and his wife Sheila built in Penarth. Well, he came from a very old shipping family in Penarth. He was an only child. His father served in the First World War, was killed in 1917. He read law at Cambridge and was called to the bar, but law did not appeal to him at all. And he took a second degree in psychology at University College London, after which he qualified as an educational psychologist working at Guy's Hospital, and then he was a conscientious objector during the Second World War. After the war, he took up a position at the University College in Cardiff, and he developed a career in psychology with a special interest in social work and in young people. After the war, with a growing family, they had 5 sons altogether. He returned to Penarth, his birthplace, and built this extraordinary house where he put together an amazing collection of contemporary art by artists such as Paul Nash, Eric Walthouse, Ray Howard-Jones. He sat on the art committee for the National Museum of Wales, and he played a key role in the Contemporary Art Society for Wales. And between 1957 and 1961, he and Douglas Wallen, who was a minister at the other Methodist church in Penarth, began talking and thinking very much about modern and contemporary painting and how they might suggest a way in which the Methodist Church could benefit in the way that the Church of England was. And John Gibbs made available a really considerable sum of money from his family trust so that a collection could be put together in what turned out to be really very, very speedy time, basically in a year. So if you think the Church of England had been commissioning for 10 or 12 years, and John Gibbs decided that it would be quite easy to catch up in a year. As I say, the first work that was purchased by Douglas Wallen was FN Sousa. There were a number of occasions where these 3 Methodists would travel to London on Methodist business to go to important meetings, and then afterwards they would do what they called the Bond Street crawl, and they would walk down Bond Street looking in the various galleries, visiting the galleries, talking to the dealers about who the artists were, whose work might they manage to purchase. And as I say, this first work was really an absolutely revolutionary piece to purchase. There's undoubtedly, Wallen wanted to really feel that the paintings that he purchased were going to be impactful. People were really going to feel moved by them. And he particularly was very excited by this painting. Coventry Cathedral was consecrated in May of 1962, and in June, this was the first painting that was purchased for the collection. Now, as I mentioned, there's been a huge new surge of interest in Sousa. There was an exhibition on him at the Whitworth Art Gallery in Manchester, and I'm just going to show you two of his other crucifixions of this period. One of them is in the Tate Gallery, painted in 1959. They are part of a group of images that Sousa created at this time, and he describes at the time what he was trying to achieve with these paintings. He writes that he set out to refute the blonde operatic Christs and flaxen-haired shy virgins that he'd been encouraged to admire at the Jesuit school he was sent to in Bombay. Instead, in these works, he created the impaled image of Christ dripping with blood, with matted hair tangled in plaited thorns. And those are his, that's a quote from him. Sousa's crucifixion at the Tate is of particular significance with a black Christ, possibly a response to racial discrimination, which Sousa felt he had suffered from. His work is influenced by South Indian bronzes and African art, and the Tate version is actually much larger than our painting. It is 6 foot by 4 foot, and it is a very impactful work. It has been displayed relatively recently, and it is quite harrowing to view it. So our painting dates from 1962, and it went straight into our collection, and it toured the following year in 1963. At that time, Sousa's works, both of these works that you see on the screen at the moment, were exhibited in an exhibition called The Human and the Divine Predicament, which was at a very famous gallery, the Grosvenor Gallery in London. And art critics such as Edward Mullins and David Sylvester compared the expressionist vernacular of Sousa's work with that of Graham Sutherland and Francis Bacon. While the Tate crucifixion by Sousa did not enter that gallery until 1993, Roger Wallen was way ahead and purchasing that work 20 years ago for us. And what we find with the world art that we now represent in our collection is that in multicultural Britain, this gives us a really broad appeal. Now, another early work purchased by Reverend Douglas Wallen was, in fact, the first work by a Welsh artist to come into the collection. And you won't be surprised to learn that there is a considerable Welsh take on the collection. The three men who were putting it together were living in Wales, were aware of Welsh artists in particular. And many of our works are either by Welsh artists or have Welsh connections. Kerry Richards was a very well-known artist in Wales. This is his Supper at Emmaus, a subject which is represented twice in the collection, and some of you may be able to see the De Maistre version as well from where you're sitting. It was purchased on the 4th of September 1962 and was the second work to come into the collection. It's really this small, vibrant watercolour, and it was a study submitted for an altarpiece competition launched by the Art Committee of St Edmund's Hall in Oxford for their chapel, and you can see it in the finalised work, you can see in situ in the chapel. So what happened very often was that Wallen would approach a famous artist and would ask if they would do a commission for the new collection. And quite often the very busy artist would say, well, I can't at the moment, but I have this study or I have this work, would this be of interest? And so that is exactly what happened in this case. It is really one of our most popular pictures and I think a quite extraordinary realisation of the Supper of Emmaus theme, that moment that their eyes were opened and they knew him. And you see this expression here, the hands clasped to the face, the chair being pushed back into our space. It is an extraordinary image with the yellow cross forming a table as well at which they are eating. So Kerry Richards spent most of his career, he came from Swansea, but he spent most of his career in London. He did come back and work at Cardiff School of Art during the Second World War. And we heard today, those of us who were at the Towner Art Gallery for the tour there, we heard a lot about his career and saw a lot of his surrealist paintings. So this is obviously a very different type of work, but he did receive a number of religious commissions. Now, another early purchase is this next work, a large-scale drawing by Elizabeth Frink, best known, of course, as an outstanding sculptor. She came to prominence when she was chosen by Basil Spence to create the Eagle Lectern at Coventry Cathedral, and we were so delighted to see the drawings this afternoon that were brought out for us at the Towner Art Gallery, her original drawings for that commission. She wasn't a well-known artist at the time at all. She had recently graduated, she was making her career, so Spence took quite a risk by choosing her, and undoubtedly going to Coventry Cathedral, seeing that work would have been of interest to Wallen, who purchased this work by her on the 10th of September 1962. And in fact, dates from a slightly earlier period. It's painted just after she comes out of Chelsea School of Art in 1956. A pietà usually includes a representation of Mary, the mother of Jesus, mourning over the body of her dead son. But Frink here focuses on the lifeless figure of Jesus alone, still crowned with thorns, the dead weight of his body captured effortlessly. And this is a really inspired early purchase. Museums and galleries today are trying very hard to buy works of art by women to redress the balance. Many of you will know that less than 4% of the artists in the National Gallery are by women. And we, right from the beginning, as I say, particularly favoured women artists. The next work to go into the collection is our abstract work, which came into the collection in early 1963, again purchased by Wallen. And this is a painting which is hanging at the back of the church here. It's oil on wood panel, former school desk. And it was purchased directly from the artist, and again we've seen some really interesting works at the Towner which very much relate to this painting. This and the Frink and the Kerry Richards were all included in that first tour. So Dennis Hawkins was really a well-known abstract painter and printmaker. He studied at Ruskin School of Drawing in Oxford and went on to the Slade. And he was taught by both William Coldstream and by Graham Sutherland. From the 1950s, he exhibited widely in leading London galleries, such as the Redfern Gallery, and his one-man exhibitions included two at the Sumner Gallery, one in 1962, obviously significant because that's most likely when Wallen would have seen his work, and another in 1964. He was a founder member of the Printmakers' Council and the Midland Group of Artists, and in many ways, he's actually better known in America than he is in this country. But he is represented in our major collections. His work can be found in the Victoria and Albert Museum and in Manchester City Art Gallery. He was a school teacher, and he taught most of his career at Repton School in Derbyshire, which of course was a well-known Church of England independent school, and he became director of art there, spending the rest of his life based in Derbyshire. He painted a number of series, a series of Pentecost pictures, re-representing the subject using colour and familiar objects, creating a sense of mystery. And I thought that I would look a little bit more at this work because of your emphasis here on Pentecost, and of course very much enjoyed being with you for your service after your opening here. He represents Pentecost, which marked the birth of the church by an intense glowing circle of white light painted on the top of an old Repton school desk. He represents here the success of the early church penetrating unlikely nooks and crannies and dark corners of the desk, illuminating the light of the Holy Spirit. In the 1960s, early 60s, Repton was throwing out these traditional desks, which I have to admit I still sat at in the 1960s in my school. We know that Hawkins asked if he could have some of them, but we only know of this example of him actually using them in his art. He later wrote that the title was given in a metaphorical sense, and as such, the work does not try to illustrate but evoke and symbolise the Holy Spirit, affirming the experience of Pentecost in all our lives. Because the image is abstract, he wrote, it witnesses to the fact that the spiritual experience is available to us all in our everyday lives, whether we recognise it or not, whether we are leaning with our elbows on a desk or not. In Pentecost 2, he also uses a symbolic circle caused by the fact that the board was employed and integrated into his composition with a circle on it. It has been very much a part of the pottery and ceramic equipment in the Repton art department, and the ring was caused by the foot of countless bowls placed on it before firing. The use of an old school desk and an old pottery board followed from his belief that if familiar objects were looked at with total openness of mind, they could speak to the viewer in new and interesting ways. And this very much would have appealed to Wallen and Gibbs because that is what they were really trying to do, to encourage people within the Methodist Church and beyond to look at these works in new ways. Now, spheres and circles were certainly a key theme for Hawkins, which he was exploring at this time, as you can see in the next slide. And actually, for those of us who were at the Towner this afternoon, we saw other circles as well. I'm showing you here the cover of the 1962 Svema exhibition, which we believe is where Wallen first saw his work, and as you can see, that was on from the 6th to the 30th of June, so at that just after that moment, that heightened interest in religious art following the consecration of Coventry Cathedral. And Hawkins really had a very high profile, which I think we'd find quite hard today to understand. He had a great following of people who purchased his work in London and over in America. So this homage to an astronaut was included in that exhibition as well. And thinking particularly, he mentions that it was John Glenn, the first American to orbit the Earth on the 20th of February 1962 in 4 hours and 55 minutes. So really focusing on someone like Glenn helps us, or reminds us, the very exciting period in 1962 that our collection was being put together. And of course we saw this afternoon that the Towner has a wonderful print as well, which celebrates the landing on the moon in 1969. So he was really wanting, as much as possible, to see his art, and particularly his religious art, seen in the forefront of developments of the 1960s. And that's very much how he exhibited it in his two exhibitions, solo exhibitions in 1962 and 1964, both of which contained Pentecostal images. Now, the pace of acquisition was really swift, as I mentioned. Wallen was on a serious mission with Gibbs to ensure that within the year they had a collection brought together that would enable them to tour throughout the country. So 2 more works were acquired in 1965, this time by a woman artist again, both by Eularia Clarke. Again, like Hawkins, Clarke was a school teacher, and again, like Hawkins, not a famous household name today. And yet her work in our collection is amongst the most popular. We always have difficulties with everybody wanting these works, and particularly wanting this work, the 5000. And sometimes if we have a multi-venue loan of the collection, you can absolutely guarantee that everybody is going to be asking for this same picture. So who was Eularia Clarke? And why don't we know her name today? Why isn't she as famous as Elizabeth Frink? Well, Eularia Clarke was married during the Second World War and had 2 young children. After the breakdown of her marriage, she was the sole breadwinner. Her husband didn't contribute to their upbringing, and so it was extremely important to her that she had a regular teaching income. She moved to Winchester, moved out of London, and she taught at West Downs School and then at St Swithin's School. In 1959, she converted to Catholicism, which coincided with her diagnosis with breast cancer. In 1960, after mastectomy, she went on a pilgrimage to Lourdes. She hadn't been able to paint over that period at all. And while she was in Lourdes, she was inspired to dedicate her life in the future as a religious painter. It was there, looking at the sick in Lourdes, that she started to paint and illustrate the gospel. She showed scenes in everyday 1960s life, translating the gospel stories so that they came alive in the here and now, in everyday life, in those audiences who viewed them. She knew her Bible stories extremely well because she had actually studied theology at St Anne's College in Oxford in the 1930s, and she'd taken extra classes at the Ruskin School of Art at the same time. Clarke follows Matthew's account in which women and children are present at the feeding of the 5,000. In fact, Clarke was inspired by a day out at Canvey Island, having observed the crowd enjoying fish and chips with tea on the boil. Her religious paintings were often described as being reminiscent of Stanley Spencer. Eularia greatly admired Spencer, and she was taught actually by his brother Gilbert, and there's an excellent exhibition of his work at the moment in the Lake District. Her paintings are less refined and more primitive than Spencer's style, but her aim was to portray the Gospels so that they could be as accessible as possible. Eularia refused to sell her religious paintings, which is why she's not so widely known today. She wanted to keep them all together to ensure that they made the most impact. So when Wallon went to visit her, he had to really persuade her to sell these works to him. This was his first choice, which he was successful in explaining to her what the mission of the collection was going to be, and she agreed to sell him that work. In this next work, the Storm Over the Lake, there was really quite a protracted negotiation because she didn't want to part with it. She said it was currently on loan to a monk who used it in daily prayer, and it simply couldn't be got, but got it was. We don't quite know how Wallon managed to persuade her, but it has entered our collection, and it shows, of course, Christ awakening and calming the storm. And she noted that the inspiration for it came from watching the traumatic drowning scene in a very popular film, The Cruel Sea, of 1952, directed by Charles Friend. In the period between 1960 and 1970, Eularia Clarke painted over 88 works depicting the gospel stories or acts of worship. So our works date from the beginning of that intense period of activity. Initially, she received commissions, for instance, for The Last Supper at the Catholic Chaplaincy in Southampton University in 1962. And she also received a commission for a series of Stations of the Cross at St Joseph's Roman Catholic Church in Havant in 1967, which sadly have disappeared. And sometimes the legacy of artists, you know, if a name is not well known, they can unfortunately be lost. She exhibited very widely. She didn't sell her works, her religious works, but she contributed to the Bible in art at the Russell Coates Art Gallery in Bournemouth in 1963, which is where we believe Wallon saw her work. She was elected to the Society of Catholic Artists in 1965, and she had a semi-permanent display of her work at Portsmouth Roman Catholic Cathedral in the crypt in the late 1960s, and then a full exhibition of her work in 1969. There was also a television programme dedicated to her on Southern Television, which was a documentary described with the title of Day by Day in 1968. Now, with your emphasis on Pentecost, I wanted to just look at this particular painting, Flame on Their Heads, of 1965. of course, illustrating Acts 2, verse 3. There appears to be many tongues of fire in this painting, and you can really see what an individual response it is. It's been described as a manic response or an energetic response, but it's certainly one that stays with you and has considerable impact. And one wonders if it was a painting that perhaps she was shown to Wallon when he was buying works from her in 1965, and perhaps she wasn't prepared to part with it. Her works become calmer and slightly more serene as she develops, and you can see here in this last painting of 1970, it was the last painting that she created. She died at the age of 56 after her cancer returned. Sadly, she eventually died of lung cancer. And this has a really serene feeling to it, which a number of her later works do. Her life had not been easy. She had to struggle to keep her family together after her husband deserted her with 2 young children. She suffered from ill health, and yet in the final decade of her life, she produced these really extraordinarily powerful religious images, which all remained in her family. They are now available on a website, and there is a book that has been published by her granddaughter. But really, until very recently, apart from our 2 works, it was almost impossible to see her paintings publicly. So that's why we don't know her name in quite the same way as we do other artists. She was also, the next slide, her works particularly inspire people to respond to them. And I wanted to just show you this example of her work on display, the 5,000 on display in 2019 at Leicester Cathedral. On Bank Holiday in May, the last Whitsun Bank Holiday, they had a picnic in the garden at Leicester Cathedral, inspired by this picture. They made tea outside. They created activities which involved making crocheted fish, which were given away to passers-by. And the Sound Cafe Choir sang a piece which was a tribute to the painting. And in fact, as the exhibition went on, by the time this exhibition finished, the whole of the area around that painting was surrounded by over 400 crocheted fish. So many different ways in which people respond to that particular painting. So I've mentioned Hawkins and Eularia Clarke, who were not well-known artists, but many of the works that came into our collection were by very established painters. And the next picture I'm going to be looking at... Oh, can we go back one? Oh. Should we go forward again? And forward again, maybe? Oh, no, I don't know what's happened to the Roberts. Oh, dear. Well, the William Roberts, I think, is on that screen, so you can have a look at it. It seems to have disappeared, sorry. A William Roberts crucifixion, which I hope you can see on the screen there. You'll just have to believe me. Sorry, I don't know where that R image is, but it looks like this, if you can see it on that screen. A very, very famous painter, trained at the Slade, was a war artist, served actually in the Royal Field Artillery, and he, like so many people, was really affected by serving at the front in the First World War, and coming back into civilian life, he very much painted a series of religious works. And our painting was actually created around the early 1920s, early 1920s, 1919 to 1920, when people were gathering in France. He was working in France for a period, and people were gathering for the negotiations around the Treaty of Versailles. There's this rather wonderful story about how William Roberts was in a cafe, and he was approached by the owner of the cafe, who said, "I have found a buyer for your incredible crucifixion," because he'd had it on display in his studio. And afterwards he found out that the buyer was in fact Augustus John, who was there to paint the portraits of many of those doing the negotiations. So that Welsh artist, Augustus John, kept this painting in his collection until the 26th of April 1963. And at that time, when it was sold at auction, John Gibbs purchased it at Christie's, and it's probably at the time it was one of the most important works in our collection. And when it went on display, when it went on tour, Douglas Wallen created some interpretation and labels saying, try to look at this picture with fresh eyes and understand what the artist is trying to convey. A large work such as this does require a number of preparatory works, and you can see in these two drawings the way in which Roberts was very carefully planning the composition, and you can see the city wall developing here in the Barnsley drawing, and the second drawings in the Imperial War Museum. There's much discussion about the fact that when you look at the drawings, they are reminiscent of some of the drawings that he did actually at the front during the First World War, and that this was some way for him of actually responding to the kind of distress that he was feeling at the end of the Second World War. So while William Roberts is an incredibly famous artist, the other artist that one would obviously want to have in a collection of contemporary religious painting was, of course, Graham Sutherland. And once more, Douglas Wallen approached Sutherland, and as he did Kerry Richards, and asked if Sutherland would be prepared to accept a commission. He explained that he was too busy at the time painting some very important society portraits, and Wallen went back again at the beginning of 1963. He still couldn't get anywhere, and then they were so fortunate, they were so lucky. In December 1963, this work came onto the open market. It came up at Sotheby's, and John Gibbs actually loved buying works at auction. He always felt you got the best prices there, and he was successful in bidding on it and acquiring it for the collection. Well, the figure of Jesus is really conveyed schematically, almost abstractly. In 1947, Sutherland had visited the Picasso Museum in southern France, and the influence of Picasso's art is very clear on him here, especially in that semicircular head of Christ. Sutherland was also very much influenced by photographs of the victims of concentration camps, which he saw in illustrated booklets at the time, but also particularly when he went to the cinema. At that time, he painted the deposition for St Matthew's in Northampton, and a related work which is now in the Fitzwilliam Museum. The Methodist work has been consistently popular with borrowers, and in 2017 you can see an image of it on display at Benridding Methodist Church in Yorkshire, where as part of an exhibition on the art of hope and reconciliation, which looked at the impact of the Second World War on artists in the collection. It was also used in 2019 for a dedicated quiet day at Laund Abbey, led by Dr. Miriam Gill, and it hung in Coventry Cathedral in September 2021 as part of the art trail for City of Culture, where it was particularly related to the experiences of Sutherland in the Second World War and artists of his generation. So during the first exhibition of the collection, we believe that over 110,000 people saw the collection at 30 different venues. So it started off in 1963 and it travelled throughout the whole of the country, finishing at the end of 1965, and then it had a little pause, and then it went off again for another year, eventually finishing in late 1967. So it was a really extraordinary first tour. I mean, we think we tour the collection a lot at the moment, and it's quite a lot of work for us, but really that first tour was very, very ambitious. And the collection went not so much to churches and cathedrals, as it does today, but much more to museums and galleries, such as Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery, Manchester City Art Gallery, the Walker in Liverpool, and so on, across the country. And we have very little information about the collection, not many images. But this is one that I'm showing you here, where you can see some very prominent Methodists present. Lord Soper, many of you may recognise, Some of you may recognise Edward Mills in the middle there, the well-known architect of many 1960s Methodist churches, and of course you can also see Reverend Douglas Wallen greeting everybody, welcoming to the opening of the exhibition. So the collection attracted very good coverage. As it travelled, it was covered in The Guardian and The Telegraph. It'd be wonderful if we could get reviews with them every time we lend the collection today. And it toured, as I say, very, very broadly. But what was interesting, every time we lend the collection, we come across new ideas, we see it in new contexts. And it was interesting for me, and knowing that this is part of your new vision for your the opening of your wonderful new church here, was to really think again about the fact that the collection travelled with what was described as a subsidiary exhibition, which was organised by Edward Mills, the architect in the centre there, and it consisted of 10 display panels and text and an architectural model of a Methodist church. It also included a selection of church chairs, including some stucking chairs by Terence Conran, and people were encouraged to sit in these chairs as they looked at our works and to see which was the most comfortable. And you're sitting in some lovely chairs this evening as you're listening to me. So it's really interesting for us to think about those original ideas and what really fascinated our founding fathers, and what they wanted to think about was the architecture of churches, the furnishing of churches, and really the design overall. So it's very interesting to think about the fact that actually this is the first time that we have been shown in a brand new church. So Edward Mills was a very famous architect. He was known for his innovative use of concrete. And we can't be certain, but we do know that this model of a Methodist church that was being built at the time was included in the exhibition. So nothing else has survived from the exhibition, but this is a little bit of conjecture on my part, but I have found this model, which is in the RIBA archive, which shows Trinity Methodist Church in Woking, which, as I was diverted round the M25 today into Woking, I did have a look, but I couldn't actually see the church. But I know there are people here who know Woking much better than I do. And it's really interesting to think that this could well have been the model. It's the right date, and the church was being built at the time that our collection was first toured. So it's rather exciting to think that that might be the case. His first church commission and church hall was in Collier's Wood in 1937, and he was really interested in flexible spaces with a focus on community and social activity, which we think about so much today. That original first church is not, sadly, a church at the moment. It's now a nursery and community hub. And after World War II, when he was a conscientious objector, he built further Methodist churches at West Greenwich and at Mitcham, as well as at Woking. And he was also responsible for the designs for a cathedral in Uganda. And he wrote a number of books on church design. So this model in the Royal Institute of British Architects is one that I'm hoping to make a appointment to go and see. It's actually an octagonal church. And Mills thought that Victorian churches were meaningless imitations of past styles, unrelated to the world in which they were built. And he aimed to achieve a new church design that would be much more flexible for the new world. So I think it's really interesting to come here to this new church and to think about your design here, to have spent a few days here seeing the wonderful flexible way in which it is used, especially with your nursery, and to welcome the preschool pupils here last Monday. Really interesting to wonder how Mills and Wallen, and indeed even Lord Soper, might have looked at us this evening in this wonderful new church, and to understand that initially these paintings were considered to be on loan and possible for the new churches that were being built. So at the end of that first tour, the collection was sent to Kingswood School in Bath. We think the reason for that, we don't know exactly. We think the reason was because 4 of the Gibbs family sons were at school in Bath, at that school, and because John Gibbs Sr. was very interested in child psychology, he was really keen that the collection should be engaging with young people. And the school had and owned a house called Summerhill House, which is where the very famous art collector Ernest E. Cook of the Cook Travel Agency family housed a superb collection of paintings, and he had died and the school had recently taken on this space. So that appears to be where the collection was originally housed at Kingswood School, and it was there until the mid-1970s, when it was decided that the collection should be spread around other Methodist schools as well. And eventually there was an understanding that it should be brought back together and used at Southlands College, where it was felt it would have more impact in the training of ministers. So it remained at Southlands for a number of years and didn't tour in quite the way that it had initially. But unfortunately, towards the end of the 1980s, there was considerable damage occurred to the paintings when there was a major flood. And at that time, a friend of the Gibbs family, Tim Egan, who was the registrar at the National Museum of Wales, agreed to go up and assess the collection. And he decided that it was best for it to be returned to Wales, where it could be conserved and reframed in the National Museum. And it was put on display at the Penarth Festival of Christian Art in the Turner House Gallery, which some of you may know, a wonderful, extraordinary gallery in the centre of Penarth. And it was very, very successful there. And at that time, the administration of the collection was taken up by the Methodist Division of Education and Youth, and it was felt very strongly that it should start touring again. It went first to St Giles Church in Oxford in 1992, and then there was a major showing in the Maltings Arts Centre in Farnham. And actually I was involved in the hanging there in 1993 with John Gibbs' son. And I hadn't actually realised, and you suddenly find yourself part of history as you become older, I hadn't actually realised that that was only the second place that it toured to in its new form. A new group of what was described as managing trustees were brought together, and the Gibbs family became much more involved in it again. And then just showing you the next slide, John Gibbs the elder, who was now, sorry. I don't know how the William Roberts got there, but anyway. Now you know what the Roberts look like. If the next slide, I think. There we go. John Gibbs the elder was very keen to support the collection again, and he gave this wonderful Patrick Heron to the collection. Heron is one of our greatest artists, and was represented this afternoon when we went to the Towner for that very interesting tour. He was a conscientious objector during the Second World War, studied at Central School of Arts and Crafts in 1953, and this work dates before his abstract period, and many of you will think of him as being an abstract artist. You'll think of him as the Great St Ives exhibition, but this is very much a work dating from 1950, from that earlier period, and inspired by a painting in the National Gallery, a Renaissance painting, which was by Titian, the Van Riemen family, and it just focuses in on the crucifix on the altar there, and it places it instead by an open window. And there's a little bit of debate about the fact that the window is open and yet the candle is blowing. If you look at the candle's blowing in the other direction than you'd expect it to be. So there's a little bit of thought around that. But anyway, John Morell Gibbs was very happy to give this to the collection, and it kind of relaunched our touring in 1992. And at the same time, his son, John Morrell Gibbs, became more interested in the collection, and he became the first chair of trustees in 1997. And he continued in that role, organising a relationship for us with Oxford Brookes University, which came out of the Westminster College amalgamations. And it was always very much hoped that Oxford Brookes would build a gallery for us, and I accompanied John on a number of occasions to discussions with various vice-chancellors, but sadly that gallery didn't actually come to fruition, and as many of you will know, we are currently searching for a new home for the collection. We're in temporary accommodation at the moment, and we very much hope to find somewhere where the collection can be shown more regularly. So John Gibbs remained as the chair of the Methodist Modern Art Collection until 2018, where, as Paul mentioned, I was the first person, not a member of the Gibbs family, to hold that position. And it's been really a great honour to take on from John, and really John's great legacy for us was expanding our collection of world art. And I'm just showing you here, of course, the incredible Jyoti Sahi, which is behind me, the Dalit Madonna, one of our most requested works, again, along with the Eularia Clarke. Of course, it's the Dalit Madonna, reflecting the Indian folk tradition of the grinding stone found in every home. The stone has two parts, the larger mother stone, fixed and stable, whilst the smaller baby stone moves to grind foodstuffs on the mother stone. And relating Mary and Jesus to this symbol links the bond between them to the preparation of daily bread on the grinding stone. It is interesting that the formerly known caste group, the Untouchables, in the Hindu caste system, now take the name of Dalit. And breaking items on the grinding stone is really associated with them. And the suffering and the relationship between Jesus and Mary is seen in this particular work as creating life and hope. And Jyoti Sahi is a particularly prolific artist. He's still living. He's known as the theologian with a brush. And he very much uses his faith in art to create a dialogue between Hinduism and Christianity. And he's one of the founding members of the Asian Christian Art Association. So as I mentioned, John went on to really develop the collection. The next slide shows a work by a Japanese Christian. Watanabe is a extraordinarily well-known printmaker. He was much influenced by Buddhist figures in his prints. Jesus here is represented clad in green in the centre, riding the donkey over ground covered with palm branches, discarded robes and flower heads. And there is really this feeling that the importance in the Mingai folk art tradition of using organic and mineral pigments which are suspended in the medium of soybean milk, really returning to the original Kisawi Mingai movement. So Watanabe is an extraordinary artist to have in the collection, quite a rare artist, and just shows the breadth of our world art collection. More women entered the collection under John Gibbs's period as chair, and this next work, the Maggie Hamling, of course, is a great firm favourite now, and it's almost impossible to believe that this work has only been in the collection since 2011. She is, of course, one of our best-known artists today. This title of this work reflects the fact that each Good Friday, Hamling has produced a painting in memory of her late mother. She puts it, striving to capture the perfect image of life and death at one and the same moment. And this is the work that she tried to create, or she created in 2006. She describes her religious position as an optimistic doubter, and that death has always been key to her work. This title reflects the homage to her mother, and she has written, "Every Good Friday, I have a go at painting Jesus. My mother was a very churchy type. Good Friday was always a miserable day, because it's life and death at that same moment, which is, of course, the point of all art." So it's really a striking work here, this wonderful impasto that she uses, and the way in which she references the many biblical references to water from the first chapter of Genesis onwards. And she writes that she believes each wave can be seen in this painting as a self-regenerative force, untamable by man, but speaking of the power of God. Another painting to enter the collection in the same year is this painting by Clive Hicks Jenkins. People often ask us how we acquire works, how we continue to expand the collection, and they can come to us as gifts or donations. In this case, we know that Clive Hicks Jenkins is a great favourite of Dr. John Newton Gibbs, and he was approached by one of the members of the committee, Dr. John Taylor, who said that he wanted to give his wife something, his wife Margaret, something to mark their golden wedding anniversary. And so John recommended that they go and talk to Clive Hicks Jenkins, who's an extraordinary artist. And I was actually director of the Barber Institute at the time, and we had an unveiling of this painting when we thought John was going to be presenting it to Margaret, and then they explained that they talked about it and decided that actually what would give them the greatest satisfaction was to present it to the collection for others to benefit from it. So a wonderful example, and I'm just showing you a detail here, of the accusers there, an extraordinary painting which means so much to so many people now and came to us through the generosity of that couple. So as I say, the collection does continue to grow in different ways. We have the Michael Edmonds painting that, could we have the next slide please? The Cross over the City, which was one of the earliest works to come into the collection. That's a multimedia work, and you can see it beautifully lit at the back here. And his family, in fact, in 2015, approached us and said, following his death, that they'd like to present a watercolour to us. And you can see a great contrast. The little watercolour is in the corner there. This beautiful watercolour. Edmonds trained actually initially as a Bevan boy and then became an architect. And didn't really paint watercolours until the end of his career. So it was wonderful to receive that watercolour as a gift. So the collection continued to tour under John's leadership, and in this slide here you can see it touring around. It went to Ellesmere Port, Wrexham, Bath Abbey, York Minster, the Beanie in Canterbury, to Dublin, many other locations, including Haywards Heath, not far from here. And I'm just showing it to you in Lincoln Cathedral in 2016, where it looked absolutely stunning in the chapter house there. And then once I took over, the first place that it toured was a multi-site tour actually in the Isle of Man in 2018, and here you can see it on display in Peel Cathedral and at a number of other wonderful rural churches. And do just note the Michael Edmonds there is actually shown, you can look, it's shown so that you look down on it, looking down on a city as it's meant to be. It looks very fine here, but it's nice to see it sometimes from a slightly different viewpoint. And then in 2019, the collection was seen in Leicester at the cathedral and across churches in the city there, and there were the most wonderful responses there, particularly from De Montfort University, where there was a fantastic dance response at the opening, and then a fantastic collection of poems was actually inspired by the collection and published there. So we had a really amazing period there, and then of course COVID hit, and we actually went into a period of rejuvenation pause, which we'd announced actually just before the lockdowns, where we were going to pause the collection, conserve them and reframe many of them. And you'll see some of the lovely new frames. I think they're all rather obvious which ones have had the beautiful new frames. But after many, many years of touring, clearly we needed to have a bit of a rejuvenation pause so that the paintings could be conserved. And our plan was to reopen at Coventry for the City of Culture. I have to say that was a little bit, it's a wonderful, wonderful exhibition in the end, but it was put off and put off and put off because we didn't know when lockdown was going to be lifted. Even when we eventually opened, we didn't know if anybody was going to turn up at the opening, and in fact we had a huge crowd and a wonderful dance response at the opening there as well. So we went to 3Generate in the Birmingham NEC for the first time actually in 2021. That's now become a really important part of our annual lending. That's the youth assembly of the church for 18 to 23-year-olds. And there was a fantastic response to the Eularia Clarke last year. I don't quite know how we're going to exceed that this year, but it is absolutely wonderful to see the numbers of young people engaging with our works there. In the next slide, I'm just going to mention the Articles of Faith exhibition again, really, because that was a huge success. We're very grateful to Richard Sharples for helping us to work with other community groups within Bristol, and we are very sure we worked with Reverend Nato of the ecumenical officer in the main Methodist Church. We're very keen to work across faith groups, and we hope to do that when we go to Bradford next year for the City of Culture and continue our interfaith work. And finally, I just want to say how grateful I am to everyone who asks to borrow the collection, who comes to see it, wherever it is on display. It's always exciting for us to see the collection on display in new places, creating new dialogues, to shed some new light on our familiar pictures. And I hope tonight that I've given a little bit of a unique history to you. You may have become very familiar with the pictures, but I hope I've put them into context and answered that question that we are so often asked: why does the Methodist Church have a modern art collection? It's really good to see the works here in your inspiring new church, and it's very exciting indeed to know that they are being appreciated so much. Paul has reported back some of the wonderful comments we've already had. So it's really great to be here. And I just want to mention our Friends organisation and to thank Catherine, the editor of our Friends newsletter, for coming down from London this evening. The Friends are a great way of continuing to support the collection and finding out what's going on. So if you're tempted at all, there are some leaflets at the back about how to join. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Anne, indeed. I know that the train is awaiting two people. Safe trip back, and thanks for coming down today. What a wonderful overview that was of the collection as a whole, some of its history, some of the significance, and highlighting some of the major artists and sculptors who played a part in the collection. Having immersed myself in the collection, it's lovely to learn new things about both some of the artists and how the works were acquired. So thank you so much for giving us that overview, and I think probably whetting the appetite to find out more as well about some of the work. So thank you very, very much, Anne, indeed. We've got a little something just to pass to you as well. We'll go downstairs for tea or coffee in a moment, but have a think. If there are any questions that you've got for Anne here and now to ask aloud, please do feel free. Otherwise, grab Anne downstairs. I think I've solved the mystery of where the collection should be held on an ongoing basis. I'll make that offer now. Give it some thought and see what you think. I found it fascinating to see, just from the slides that you showed, how different exhibitions have structured the pieces, even just glimpses. Some highly similarly,
Yes.
with the elements of Holy Communion and the Darling Madonna either side of a huge cross.
Yeah, but I've not seen this exact...
No, but others completely differently, where our exhibition is sort of power of Christ and passion of Christ, presence of Christ, but to see some of the images and how others have done it, including the cross over the city, or the horizontal, that's fabulous as well.
And I think the way, the prominence you've given the Broker time, I understand he was here and Pat was interviewing him on Sunday, so that must have been a wonderful moment.
Fabulous, yes. Yvonne, come forward. We're just going to just...
Oh, how lovely.
I hope they survive the journey back. Take them. I hope they do. Thank you, not just for this evening, Anne, but for all that you have done for us. You've been incredibly helpful. Thank you once again.
Can I just say thank you to Pat and Paul for all that they have done, and Alan in particular, who has been very, very patient with me tonight with my PowerPoint. So thank you all indeed for your hospitality.
Thank you. Are there any questions that you've got burning now that you would like to just pop your hand up and fire away, whether it's about the history of the collection or a particular piece, something going on here, and Anne or I or Pat will try and answer. Catherine, yes.
And you want to say, are you allowed to say something about our new acquisition?
Oh, I don't know. Everything's so strict about what we can say. So I tried to give some examples of how we actually, this isn't a hint by the way, Paul, but how we actually acquire works, because that's something that people do ask us about. And we have had an example very recently of such successful fundraising when the collection went to Dublin, that they had some funding left over, and they noticed that we didn't have any Irish artists in the collection, and we're about to announce in our autumn newsletter that we do have a new Irish work in the collection. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say exactly what it is, but I'm going to tell you that actually it's a real departure for us. It's a piece of stained glass. So you have to join up to the Friends and get the newsletter to find out what it is exactly. But it's really wonderful to see people wanting to engage with us every time we come somewhere, every time we visit and we meet new people. There are ways in which they tell us about what they'd like to see in the collection and help us help it to grow.
Fabulous, thank you. Any other questions?
Where is this going next?
Well, that's also... so next year, as I mentioned, it's definitely going to be in Bradford in 2025 in the autumn. It's also definitely going to be in Leicester. And we have two other possibilities of where it might be earlier in the year, around Lent, possibly in Oxfordshire, possibly in Cumbria. So we'll be publishing that as well in our autumn newsletter, but it could be one of the busiest years that we've ever had.
In that case, I think we will draw our time in this space to a close and retire downstairs for tea and coffee. I think just one final observation I just wanted to say. It was amazing to see Trinity Methodist Church Woking up there.
That was going to be a surprise for you. Isn't that close to your heart?
It is. Well, I happened to be married in that church a few years ago, and Trinity sent a minibus load of their members down here on Saturday. So we had 14 or 15 of our Trinity friends who came and enjoyed the collection. And I think that it was probably about 20 years ago that Trinity had a portion of the collection as an exhibition in there as well.
And I wonder if anybody made that link with Mills, actually, because it's not something that we normally talk about, the fact that there was this architectural, church furnishings. I mean, really, in the initial aims that John Gibbs and Wallen wanted, they wanted people to think about every design, about the chair that you sat on when you looked at the paintings, even the knives and forks that you eat with in the church halls when they were celebrating the collection. So I don't know what your knives and forks are like here, but I hope you've given the design of them a bit of thought.
Right, Maggie, this is over to you afterwards, okay? Well, listen, thank you again for coming out tonight on a dark and wet, windy evening. It's been a fabulous evening to have. Let's go and have tea and coffee downstairs and more conversation, please. Thank you again.